these giant people riding on monsters, charging them, firing these flames at them, and it just caused the Aztec armies to break and run and made the Spanish conquest pretty easy. There are other aspects of the Spanish conquest, such as the fact that they kidnapped the Aztec emperor, held him for ransom, they got paid the ransom, then killed him anyway. I mean, it's a pretty sad story, but the Spanish effectively conquered Mexico that way. And they conquered the rest of Central America. Pizarro conquers the Incas in Peru in much the same manner. And by about 1550, all of Central and South America is in Spanish hands. Spain sends officials it calls viceroys who come over. A viceroy is somebody who rules in the name of the king. The viceroys are set up in special districts and they rule directly on authority of the king in Spain. Now, they rule the area directly. There's no autonomy left to the people living there. And also the Spanish begin to set up huge agricultural plantations. And they begin to grow cash crops, which they then send back to Europe for sale, and they make lots of money off these cash crops, like tobacco and sugar cane and other kinds of cash crops. Because the amount of land in Europe was limited, it seemed unlimited in America. You can have these huge plantations. Now, of course, one of the problems is you've got to have labor to work these plantations, and that's later on going to lead to the import of slaves into the area, which begins to happen a little bit later after the Spanish conquest. But there's something else interested the Spanish. Ever since Columbus's day, they had noticed when they came over that a lot of the natives they met seemed to have an awful lot of gold things. Gold jewelry, gold implements. And they'd ask them where they got them and they would never really get a straight answer. And the Spanish developed this theory that somewhere in the New World there must be an immense amount of gold that these Indians were getting all their gold stuff from. And that led to the theory about El Dorado, the city of gold somewhere, waiting to be discovered and, basically melted down by the Spanish and taken back to Europe. So they start to search all over for El Dorado or whatever other kind of gold they can find. And they go everywhere. The conquistador Coronado comes up into North America, goes as far north as Kansas looking for El Dorado. Of course, they never find it, but they do find something else. Down in Bolivia, in the mountains, the Spanish stumble upon what is, in fact, the wealthiest silver and gold mine anybody had ever seen. It was called the mine of Potosi. It was worked by the local Indian population. It turned out precious metals. It even turned out jewels. And it was probably better than finding El Dorado because you don't have to melt this down. All you got to do is get it up out of the mine. Of course, there are not nearly enough Spanish to do this mining, and so they conquer all the local Indians and turn the local Indians into slaves virtually. They send them down to the mines. They bring the precious metals up. They have smelting furnaces right there on site. They smelt the precious metals. They make them into either bars or coins or other objects, and they put them on ships, and they send them back to Spain. Whole fleets, entire fleets, full of gold and silver and other precious things going back to Spain every single year. These are the famous treasure fleets. And a lot of these Spanish who are involved in this trade become wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. And Spain itself, in some ways, becomes quite wealthy from it. Well, these discoveries and exploration had a profound impact on wider European society and the development of the European economy and European political system. And we'll just finish up this lecture by talking about some of the social economic impacts of it, and then we'll take a look at the political impacts of it in the next lecture. So, huge amounts, fleets loaded with gold and silver coming back into Spain. Now, you'd think that would make Spain the world's wealthiest nation. In fact, it does turn Spain into a major power, militarily and economically. But one of the problems is that almost as soon as the money came back into Spain, it really flowed out of Spain. And the reason for this was that Spain had been constantly fighting wars. The wars of unification, wars in other areas in Europe. And they'd taken out many, many loans to fight these wars from foreign bankers. And as soon as the gold and silver flows into Spain, they pretty much owe it to the bankers they've taken loans from. And so the money goes out of Spain like a revolving door into the coffers of mainly German and Italian bankers who had supplied the previous wars that Spain fought. So Spain does not get the opportunity to invest these riches in its economic infrastructure. Some wealthy upper-class people in Spain become even wealthier by keeping some of the money, but it doesn't really fortify the Spanish economy. However, it does give Spain enough wealth to build a powerful military apparatus. And Spain pretty soon has the biggest, most effective infantry in Europe. It has one of the biggest fleets, the best equipped fleets. So militarily, they do prosper from it. As the silver and gold and other precious items spread all over Europe, it really revolutionizes or changes in a profound way the European economy. There had long been in Europe a shortage of precious metals. The gold and silver mines were just simply mined out, and there weren't really very many other sources of specie coming into Europe. And another problem was when Europeans traded with Asia, in many cases the Asians would only accept gold and silver as payment. They didn't want European goods. And so there was a precious metal drain out of Europe to Asia. And now the first thing that happens is the balance of trade is restored. Precious metal is coming into Europe from the New World, stays in Europe for a little time, and then a lot of it flows back out to Asia in the Asian trade. But also the European money supply grows. By 1650, for example, the supply of silver has just about tripled. And anytime you introduce a large amount of new money into the money supply, which is essentially what's happening, you have inflation. And that's what happens here in this case. The influx of precious metals into Europe kicks off a booming period of price inflation all through Europe. Well, an interesting thing happens from this price inflation. I mean, a lot of things happen from it, but one of the interesting things is it was misunderstood. Because the European economy really had not experienced inflation in hundreds of years. Maybe never, but they really didn't understand what inflation was. And so when all of a sudden prices started to go up and profits appeared to be going up, they thought, well, the economy's expanding, we're doing great. And as a result of that, many businessmen expanded their business, expanded their trade, began trading on a bigger scale, and the inflation actually led to a period of real economic growth, which wouldn't happen in the modern world where inflation is considered a plague, but it really set off a period of true economic expansion that had all sorts of consequences. Another reason that we see inflation and prices going up in Europe during this period is that after about the year 1460, the European population starts to increase again. And that's, of course, for the first time European population has increased since the plague. Historians are not clear exactly why in 1460 population began to go up again, but it did. And as a result of that, there was an increased demand for food to begin with, for clothes and other items, even for manufactured goods, and this drove up prices, but also encouraged business expansion. Another aspect that helps the European economy that we'll come back to later is that Europe is at this point engaged in a period of relative political stability. And this political stability, peace and prosperity, for the most part, as we've seen in Renaissance Italy, does lead to economic prosperity and cultural flourishing, and all this also had an effect on the wider European social scene. Okay, let me say a few things about how increasing population affected Europe in the years after 1460, and then we'll bring this lecture to an end. It's very hard to have specific figures about population growth in the early modern period because records were just simply not that accurate. There are good tax records remaining from certain cities, like Florence, for example, the Catasto, and certain countries like England kept very good treasury records, and from that you can trace taxes, from that you can trace households, you can make an estimate of the number of people in the household, and you can get an idea about the population. So from these kind of rough ways, we estimate that between 1460 and 1600, European population grew by about 50%, which is a dramatic population growth. Cities grow even faster. The general population is growing, but at the same time, populations of cities are growing and people are moving into cities. And so urbanization and the increasing size of cities goes at a faster rate than even the general population growth. To give you an example, London in the century between 1500 and 1600 goes from a city of 50,000 people to a city of about 200,000 people, which makes it one of the top couple of cities in all of Europe. Prices continue to go up. Increased demand for food and other things drives prices up. When you look at the overall economic situation, food prices tend to drive other prices. So when food prices go up, it brings other prices along with them. And during the course of that century, the 16th century, which is a century of economic expansion, the cost of wheat, for example, increases about 5 times. And that's important because wheat is a staple of everybody's diet. Most peasants live off of different kinds of grains, usually not totally wheat, but barley, oats, rye, other kinds of grains. But the upper classes are more reliant on wheat because they make white bread from the wheat. And when wheat prices go up, it just elevates grain prices in general, food prices in general, and all prices in general. Along with this, the growing demand of the growing population causes trade volume to increase all around Europe. The two main trading areas nearby Europe are the Mediterranean, which the Italians still pretty much dominate, and then the Baltic area, which the Dutch and the Swedes dominate pretty much. And these are two very different trading areas. In the Mediterranean, the top trade is the spice trade still, even though the Portuguese have cut into it. In the Baltic, on the other hand, the trading is more in bulk goods. Wheat coming from the Ukraine, timber, tar and pitch used in shipmaking, lumber used in shipmaking coming from Scandinavia. All these things are brought back largely on Dutch ships to Amsterdam and other Dutch cities where they're stored up, sold to the rest of Europe, and then the Dutch are making a lot of money in this trade. Industry begins to expand all across Europe. The demand for clothes is going up, so the demand for woolen cloth is going up. And here especially the English and German woolen cloth industries really expand. The Italians are a little bit lagging behind in this expansion as far as woolen cloth goes. Banking expands. No longer are the Italians the main bankers. There are a lot of other bankers now. A lot of bankers in Germany, for example, the well-known Jakob Fugger the Rich establishes the Fugger Bank, which later on has a key role in the Reformation. A lot of important money being made in banking in this period. And social change begins to happen. As the population goes up, wages go down. As wages go down, peasants can't afford to buy food and they're miserable. But as the population goes up, prices go up, and the agricultural owners of plantations, the nobles, they get higher prices, they get higher profits. They're making a lot of money and they're happy. So there's a gap between rich and poor. And that's another important social aspect of change in this period.